Good evening, everybody. It is nice meeting you on a Sunday evening. In a normal course, these Sunday evenings would never been thought about for a session about learning something or sitting together to deliberate. Mostly we have these Sundays for the families. But as many things have gone for us, this lockdown situation has in fact brought about these changes where we are able to even think about sitting on a Sunday evening discussing some law subjects. It is very nice of you. And after this lockdown came into place, since the COVID-19 was declared as a pandemic, Madras Tax Bar had been in the forefront, keeping us engaged with very many interesting topics, discussions. It is not only sessions, it is not sessions by way of lectures. I find that the group was very active, exchanging various pleasantries and at times entertaining themselves. So it was a very energetic group which had come together to ensure that the legal community is not left behind in terms of the fraternity which they show amongst themselves. And in the process, they have gone ahead with these webinars, which had been very useful, very educative for the younger generation in the bar. So in that, when this Madras Tax Bar extended me one more invitation of participating in a session with you, that was the best thing which could have happened. I immediately grabbed the opportunity and I said, yes, I will come back to have a session. Having said that, last 30 or 40 days, we had so many webinars and sessions, lectures going on various topics. In fact, there had been specific lectures on this insolvency and bankruptcy code itself. And we were given to learn a lot of nuances and niceties of the provisions in the code, the procedures involved. In fact, I was part of one session where an introduction to IBC was spoken to, and we had many coming forth in continuation of that. So therefore, when our friends wanted a session on IBC, I was looking at why can't we put it as a question to ourselves and work on one particular area of that code and try to find an answer to that. So that is how the topic for the day has come as IBC, is it a creditor's paradise? Now, why this question? Is it a creditor's paradise? If you just go back on the historical background to this legislature, as we had seen in other sessions also, the IBC itself came into place with a tagline saying that there had not been an effective mechanism or the law was not able to deliver in cases of DRT Act and SERFACI Act. Therefore, a huge NPA has been building up. There was some requirement to address this. Now, this apart, the requirement of the IBC was also on the context of consolidation of all the laws on the insolvency resolution. As you are aware that there were enough reports saying that India lacks in terms of early resolution of insolvency issues, and the index, world index as far as India is concerned in the ease of doing business was at its lowest. So all these factors were there. That is the historical background in which the IBC comes into place. Now the code was enacted, supported by a report of the Bankruptcy Laws Reforms Committee, an expert committee which was asked to go into and suggest ways and means as to having a consolidation of laws as well as an effective mechanism for insolvency resolution, be it the case of companies or individuals. The code ultimately had repealed all the enactments which were in place. So this is all on the historical background. But one pointer as we look through this historical background is that the requirement of the creditors for an early resolution of their non-performing asset was also a factor which was being looked into. Now, having said this, did the Bankruptcy Laws Reforms Committee, namely the BLRC, CR, or the enactment, the initial bill which was circulated before the Parliament, provided for any kind of a solution for the creditors' problem? If you look in those angles, the entire report or the earlier bill, anything, there was no such proposal as to the creditors have to be resolved. Therefore, we are looking at. On the other hand, the insolvency resolution of companies and individuals were the focal point. Now, when they said, the code brought about two major things. I'm only looking at what is relevant for today's topic. I will not take you through the entire thing, which had been there in the other sessions also. Likewise, what I am proposing to do in the session is that give you a brief background and let us together read through certain provisions of the code and the jurisprudence which has evolved in terms of judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court, and try to find an answer to this question which we have posed to ourselves. Now, in that last session, I have also requested our friends, a few of us can join and we can have a deliberation and find an answer so that the other participants would be benefited and would come out with a finite result as to what is the answer to this question. This is what is the small framework which I am looking at for the today's session. So when I said about this background to the legislature, what is the object of the code as it is in the enacted law? Just look at the object of the code, which in fact takes certain aspects from the report of the Bankruptcy Laws Reforms Committee. Now, in the objects, they speak about maximization of assets. They speak about resolution of the insolvency situation by reorganization of the corporates. Then they speak about deciding on the priorities among the stakeholders. I am emphasizing this word. They did not say among the creditors. They in fact said among the stakeholders. So primary thrust was that you have to look around for a reorganization of the insolvency situation instead of looking for a liquidation. Now, in the process of reorganization, what they ultimately wanted to look at is that there should be a maximization of the value of asset. Now, when they speak about value of asset, it is not the value of asset in the hands of the creditors. Because when we speak on assets, in this economic scenario of a creditor-debtor relationship, there are two assets in consideration. One is the asset of the company, which is called as a corporate debtor under the code, or the asset of an individual. Now, second thing is the asset in the hands of a bank, which is nothing but the realization which they have to make, which they call it as an asset in their books, and which asset in terms of the Reserve Bank of India guidelines at one point of time becomes a non-performing asset. So therefore, the objects of the code did not mean an asset of the bank or a financial institution, or more particularly a creditor. It only said maximization of the assets of the corporate debtor or the individuals. So this had been the object. So the very object of the code, I will read through the portions of the object also. You will be able to make out a clear case that what was looked at is not an aiming provision or an aiming enactment for the creditors to step in to ensure their resolution. What was looked at was the resolution of the insolvency situation in a company and individuals. So this is one small background which you will have in your mind. Now with this, for today's topic, what we need to look at is when we speak about creditors. Now, how these creditors are dealt with in the code. Is there any classification for them? Is there any categorization for them? Then what the provisions of the code speak about these creditors, rather their rights and obligations or other situations which will come into consideration while implementing the provisions of the code. Then if in a situation of a resolution happening under the provisions of the code, what role the creditors play for such resolution is the other area which we have to look. Now, in all these process, the code says if there is no resolution possible, if there is no reorientation of the company or reorganization of the business possible, then naturally it goes to the liquidation or bankruptcy. Now, in such a liquidation, again, what is that the creditors have as a say is the third situation. So this will be all the situations which we have to look. Now, therefore, what we have to primarily see is that what is this classification of creditors, or how the creditors are placed within the scheme of the code. As you all aware, prior to the coming into force of this code, the insolvency resolution was sought to be resolved by invoking provisions of Companies Act in case of companies, and by invoking provisions of Provincial Insolvency Acts as well as Presidency Towns Insolvency Act in cases of individuals. Now, under that regime, under the earlier regime of enactments, the creditors were looked at only in two categories. Either you call a creditor as a secured creditor or an unsecured creditor. There was no other situation. So if a person has a security to realize his dues, a security created in his favor, then he is a secured creditor. And if a person has only a liability to be recovered, he doesn't hold a specific security and he has to look for the general assets of the company, he is an unsecured creditor. So this is the only situation which was prevailing. As you are fully aware, under the Companies Act, in fact, whenever a winding up or liquidation was sought to be initiated against the company, the secured creditors were not given much of a preference. The court will always look down saying that you are a secured creditor, you have a security, why can't you invoke, why can't you enforce that and look for your recovery? Why do you want to come to the court to seek for a winding up of a company, which is a going concern? This was the primary issue which used to come. So it is only mostly the unsecured creditors who are able to demonstrate before the court that there is a mismatch of assets and liabilities of a company. The liabilities are far in excess to the value of the assets. Therefore, have a liquidation or a winding up against the company commenced. They were primarily before the court to seeking for it. Now, in the entire exercise of a winding up or a liquidation of a company or a insolvency of an individual or going through a bankruptcy proceedings of an individual, the underlying factor was that if there had been a mismatch, there is a requirement of ensuring equitable distribution of the assets. So what was primarily the lookout is that don't allow that particular company or individual to incur more liabilities when the existing liabilities cannot be discharged. Don't allow the company or an individual to go ahead with dilution of their assets when the liabilities are far excess to that. So therefore, put a stop to that and bring them to a table and see that how these assets can be liquidated to make a distribution to the creditor. So underlying principle was there should be an equitable distribution of the assets in case of such insolvency situation arising. Now from there in IBC, what is the change which has got about? Two things. At the first instance, when I said about the creditors in the previous regime being recognized as secured and unsecured alone, now the IBC courts brings in a completely different understanding of the situation. What the IBC code provides for is that creditors can be classified into two. It says a person who is to recover a financial debt is a financial creditor. If a person who is to recover an operational debt is an operational creditor. So a classification has been brought about, dismantling the entire situation of secured or unsecured and bringing in a situation of either it is a financial debt or an operational debt. Now provisions are there, definitions are being provided. The financial debt is defined, operational debt is defined. On a broader scale, if you look at any person who lends money to a company, for a time value of that money, suppose he stipulates that you have to pay this money with so much of interest. It stipulates that after a period of time, the money has to be paid with further additions to so much of money. If there is a stipulation of time value to the money, and that kind of transaction is recognized as a financial transaction, and a liability which arises under such financial transaction is a financial debt. Therefore, if a person has to recover a financial debt, he is a financial creditor. Now, what is the other situation? It is the operational debt. That is being defined as any liability which arises on account of supply of goods or rendering of services is being termed as an operational debt. So that is qualified to a very small extent. In fact, if you go through the definitions, which I will try to point out to you at a later part of the session, financial debt is defined in a very, very, very exhaustive terms, because financial debt, they also bring in securities debt, securities creation of security interest, trustees, debentures, everything has been brought in. Therefore, there is an exhaustive definition for a financial debt. For the operational debt, it only says in the liability arising on account of supply of goods or services being rendered. So the categorization of creditors now under the IBC regime falls in two. Either it is financial creditor or operational creditor. So therefore, these two things has to be looked into when we have to look for an answer to the question which we have raised. Now, other than this, what is the other important aspect under the code which has some say in respect of these creditors? That important aspect is a institutional mechanism which the code provides in a manner of driving this insolvency resolution process. See, as you are aware, under the IBC, if an insolvency, if a petition is filed either by the financial creditor or operational creditor before the NCLT, and if the NCLT finds that there is a debt and default, I in fact pointed out in an earlier session that an exhaustive definition is there for this debt and default. More than debt, an exhaustive definition for a claim, because what is the definition of debt is any liability arising on account of a claim. So it goes on to a point saying that any liability arising on account of a claim. So therefore, claim is to be looked into. No specific definition is provided to claim. Now, in the definition of claim, it is very, very interesting. If you see, it says any liability arising on account of any transaction, which may be, it says legal, equitable, on a judgment. So it goes on to say so many things. So this is one area which I had pointed out saying that, which is new under the IBC. Now let us come back to this situation where the NCLT finds that there is a debt and a default. So these are the only two triggering factors which will trigger to a situation of insolvency being initiated. Now on an application, having found this, the NCLT says, admits the petition and says that corporate insolvency resolution process starts. Now this process has to end within a time frame. One of the main features of the code is that a time-bound mechanism of arriving at either as a resolution or pushing the company to a liquidation. So every aspect of the code, every performance under the code is time-bound. So therefore, within this time-bound, this corporate insolvency resolution has to happen. Now, who has to drive this? The code finds out certain institutional mechanism, which I will broadly point out is that one, a regulator, namely Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, IBBI. Then it brings in a professionalism in the nature of an insolvency professional being recognized as a professional under the code, who is being appointed as a resolution professional for carrying out this CIR. Now, otherwise, how this gets driven is that the committee of creditors is put in place. The code defines a committee of creditors and vests with them certain rights, obligations. As you see the scheme of the code, the entire corporate insolvency resolution process has to be driven by this committee of creditors. When I say this, I'm conscious of the fact that IBC also addresses the insolvency resolution of individuals and partnership firms. Now, in cases of individuals and partnership firms, there is no concept of committee of creditors. There, the creditors are arrived at, there is a list of creditors, and entire mechanism is different. I will not trouble yourself going through that for the present. Now, let us look at only the corporate insolvency resolution. So, this committee of creditors will drive the entire situation. Specific provision provides that they have to perform these duties and obligations during the process. Now, once we speak about committee of creditors, who are the participants, who are the members of this committee of creditors? The financial creditors are the only persons who can constitute as member of the committee of creditors. Now, if in a case there are no financial creditors, yes, of course, the code provides a different situation where the operational creditors can also be part of the committee of creditors. If there are financial creditors, even if it is one financial creditor, he alone constitute the committee of creditors. Code, of course, says that if the operational creditors' debt is more than 10% of the entire liability of the company, they can have a representative in it. So this is how it goes on. So therefore, the committee of creditors is the other thing which we have to look at to find an answer to the question which you have posed. So therefore, I have pointed out that the basic object behind the enactment Then I pointed out as to the factors which the code brings in terms of categorization of creditors into financial and operational, then the committee of creditors. So one more major thing which the IBC has sought to achieve is that from the earlier regime, when throughout the proceedings under the winding up or the insolvency of individuals under the old enactments, or as you are aware, cases which went before SICA for resolution, then cases which the banks sought to initiate before DRT under the RDB Act for recovery of its dues, and in cases where they wanted to invoke SARFAESI. In all these situations, it was the debtor who was in possession of the assets. If it is a company, company was continuing. Debtor was in possession. Until in cases of SARFAESI where the entire possession was taken over and then property was sold. Generally, the regime was recognized as a debtor in possession where insolvency resolution was sought to be achieved. Now, what IBC did is that a complete change to the situation. Now, the situation is that a creditor in control. So the entire shift is from debtor in possession to creditor in control. So this becomes significant because we are trying to find an answer whether IBC is the paradise of creditors. So from the very manner in which, or the very concept in which the code was brought into, shows that they wanted to give a kind of control with the creditors. Therefore, debtor in possession situation turned into creditor in control. How is that? Now, in cases of IBC proceedings, as I said, once the CIRP is initiated, the debtor is out of the business. The debtor is out of the property. Now, if it is the directors who have been functioning, carrying on the activities of the company, directors are treated as suspended directors. The board stands suspended. All their powers, including the powers of the shareholders, are suspended. So all of them are kept away. Insolvency professional is stepping in and he tries to manage this company, maintain this company, preserve this company, and if it is a going concern, ensure that it continues with the status of a going concern. And within that period of time, say 180 days, and with an extension it is 270, and with subsequent amendment, now the code says 330 days. So in total, either it is 180, 270 or 330, there is to be a resolution which has to happen. Till such time, the resolution professional manages everything. Now to aid in that resolution, to aid in that entire CIRP process, the committee of creditors steps in. So these are all the crucial things which we look at. Now going by the object of the enactment, going by the provisions as the scheme of the code unveils, the rights of the financial creditors or operational creditors and the COC, what are the functions of the COC, as I take you through those provisions also, you will try to appreciate. Going by all those things, you will find it is not actually the object of the code to ensure that there is a creditor's paradise. But now, down the line, is it that which is prevalent is a question which we have to find out. Now, for that, what we can further look at is that other than the provisions of the code, last 4 years, it has been in implementation. Therefore, lot of jurisprudence has come in terms of interpretation to the provisions of the code, judgments by the high courts, judgment by the Supreme Court, judgments by Honorable the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal. Now, all these things are jurisprudence which are available before us to again look into to find out whether there is an answer to this question which we are posing to ourselves. I have said about resolution process. A resolution plan has to be placed, which has to be approved by again the committee of creditors. Now, once the committee of creditors approves it, it goes before the NCLT for an approval. So the judgments will also speak about what is that the committee of creditors has to look into, what is that the NCLT has to look into. Is it the committee of creditors are given the entire power, or that the NCLT is given the entire power to examine whether the resolution plans? That we will read some paragraphs of judgment, we will be able to understand what it provides for. Now, if this resolution is not happening, now ultimately company goes for a liquidation. Now in the liquidation, what is the stand of these creditors again? Is it again, they have a bigger say in the manner in which their rights to be determined or their recovery to be made, or it is the other way? Now in that liquidation process, if you look at, creditors have a better say. Because ultimately in a liquidation, what is to be seen is that how the creditors, how the stakeholders are being satisfied from sale of the assets. So that is ultimately ends up in a situation where the creditors have to be paid their dues. It is as simple as that. Now in the liquidation process, again, there is a huge change with the IBC has brought about, which is known as a waterfall mechanism of distribution to all the stakeholders. That is provided under section 53 of the code. Now under this waterfall mechanism, again, creditors stand at the top. They have to be satisfied first. Now, next leg, it says creditors will also stand pari passu with the workmen to an extent of about 12 months or 24 months. Then it goes on to say employees to a particular period. Then unsecured creditors. Then it goes on to address government dues. This is in fact a complete shift from what was provided under the Companies Act old either 1956 or 2013, where at the second stage itself, the first stage was that secured creditors and the workmen pari passu, then the government dues, and then the other things were there. Now this has been changed. Now creditors, then creditors to the extent which they have not been satisfied by the securities will stand with the workmen, then other things. On top of all those things, the cost of the CIRP cost, the entire process cost is the first preference that is to be discharged. Now imagine a situation, a company is able to realize only 10,000 rupees and ultimately the CIRP cost is only 10,000. That gets satisfied. Others don't get even a pipe. This is what is the provisions under the code, which is called as waterfall mechanism. Now this section 53 is also being quoted in the resolution. Under section 30, the code specifically says if there is a resolution plan, that resolution plan has to provide a payment to the operational creditors to the extent what they would have realized if it had gone for a liquidation under the waterfall mechanism of section 53. Likewise, it says if there are dissenting financial creditors, they have to be provided to the extent what they would have recovered if it had gone for a liquidation. So this is also read into. So the entire distribution as far as code is concerned is driven by that one particular section and a mechanism which is provided. So therefore, you will find that creditors have a bigger say. Now jurisprudence, again, if you look at it, there is a slight shift from this situation also as to many judgments which have come. So that also we will consider. So I have at the first instance given you a framework of the code in the context of the question which we have raised for ourselves. I have not touched about any other thing. Within that framework, the object, the characterization of the creditors under the scheme of the code, and two different creditors being recognized, and the committee of creditors, who constitute the committee of creditors. And with this, if there is going to be a resolution, what is the mechanism, who has a say as far as the resolution is concerned. Then I pointed out if it is going to be a liquidation, how the distribution, how it happens. So this is the entire scenario which I am placing before you as far as the framework of the code. Now, as I said, if you have to find an answer to the question which you have posed, let us also look into the jurisprudence. So for a moment, what I will do is that I will share the screen to bring about only a few definitions which we will take note. We can read through that, then get into the decisions of the various courts as to these aspects. Now with that, probably a few of us will deliberate on it and find if there is an answer to that. Now let me please share with you the certain definitions. Yes. See, I have just given out the background. I will not read through entire things. Please see only the, see when IBC came into place, the committee's report had categorically pointed out what they are looking at, liquidation versus reorganization. They have also said maximization of the assets shall be the objects. Now the DLRC report enumerated the following as certain basis for which they are proposing to come up with a new law. The committee chose the following principles to design the new insolvency and bankruptcy resolution framework. The code will felicitate the assessment of viability of the enterprise at a very early stage. The law must explicitly state that the viability of the enterprise is a matter of business and that matters of business can only be negotiated between the creditors and debtor. While viability is assessed as a negotiation between creditors and debtor, the final decision has to be an agreement among the creditors who are the financiers willing to bear the loss in the insolvency. The legislature and the courts must control the process of resolution, but not be burdened to make business decisions. The law must set up a calm period for insolvency resolution where the debtor can negotiate in the assessment of viability without fear of debt recovery enforcement by creditors. So please note this point 2 as well as point 4. Point 2 at the end, they said, final decision has to be an agreement among the creditors who are the financiers willing to bear the loss. Now, point 4 said, the debtor can negotiate in the assessment of viability without fear of debt recovery enforcement by creditors. Then point 5, the law must appoint a resolution professional as a manager of the resolution period so that the creditors can negotiate the assessment of viability with the confidence that the debtors will not take any action to erode the value of the enterprise. So it was a balancing situation as between debtors and creditors. Now, as far as I look at it, it never gave an edge to the creditors. It never spoke about the requirement of the creditors' realization should be the priority. It rather said that it should be looking towards a reorganization which shall be in the nature of negotiation between the creditors and debtors. Why they said this? That they recorded in the report also that earlier regime, the rights of debtors were before a different forum, the rights of creditors were before a different forum. Take an example of a recovery of a debt to be made by a bank or a financial institution. They were invoking DRT or SARFAESI. Now, if the company is facing situations of an unsecured debt, or the company finds it that they need a cool-off period because of certain business failures or because of certain constraints, like the constraint of a pandemic which is coming up now. Now, where do they go and have it addressed? They could have at the most gone to the company's court or at the most gone to the SICA. Now, more particularly after the SARFAESI came, SICA became redundant because in a SARFAESI action, once it is taken, the SICA proceedings became abated. So therefore, one thing which the committee found is that the rights of individuals were before different forums. Therefore, they said, once IBC is coming into place, let us see that the rights are also before the same forum. Therefore, they use the word saying that a negotiation between the creditors and debtors. Now, this is what they said as a design for the framework which they want to put in place. This is the report of the committee. Now, this is the object which is there under the code itself. Object says, an act to consolidate and amend the laws relating to reorganization and insolvency resolution of corporate person, partnership firms, and individuals in a time-bound manner for maximization of the value of assets of such persons to promote entrepreneurship, availability of credit, and balance the interest of all stakeholders, including alteration in the order of priority of payment of government dues, and to establish an insolvency. So we are not concerned with the last portion for the today's talk. Now, in terms of the today's question, if you go and see in the objects also, you don't find that there is an emphasis for a creditor to have a control over the entire situation or the creditor to recover the dues. Then, now with this, as I said, within the framework of the code, I will try to point out certain definitions. Let us read through these definitions alone before we go to the judgments and then arrive at as to what will be the answer to the question. Now, on the definitions, section 5, subsection 7 and 8. Subsection 7 defines financial creditor means any person to whom a financial debt is owed and include a person to whom such debt has been legally assigned or transferred to. Now, therefore, what is a financial debt? Now, financial debt means a debt along with interest, if any, which is disbursed against the consideration for the time value of money and includes, as an inclusive provision, it says money borrowed against payment of interest, any amount raised by acceptance under any acceptance credit facility or its dematerialized equivalent, any amount raised pursuant to any note purchase facility or so and so. These are all bonds, debentures on the stock market side or the debt security side. Then the amount of liability in respect of lease or hire purchase contract, which is deemed as a finance or capital lease under the accounting standards. Then receivables sold or discounted other than any receivable sold on non-recourse basis. Any amount raised on any other transaction, including any forward sale or purchase agreement having the commercial effect of borrowing. So therefore, they said even certain agreements which has an effect of commercial borrowing. imagine a situation like you get a huge advance. You propose a transfer of certain goods. You are looking at manufacturing certain goods. You have not even got into it. But you get into an agreement with a person saying that you advance me this much of money. Then down the line, after 1 year, once the goods are produced, I will continue to supply a particular percentage to you. Then over the period of time, I will repay this advance with some interest. So if any such transaction also gets into the definition of liability if it is a financial debt. Then explanation, it goes on to say for the purpose. Now the explanation is one area which deals with the rights of flat buyers in cases of real estate properties. Therefore, they have touched upon RERA and other things. I will, for the moment, skip it. I will also point out that aspect of it. Now, financial creditor is not in any manner seen as a secured or unsecured. It is based only on the financial debt. And then it says financial creditors are the part of committee of creditors. Now, please see the definition of operational creditor. The definition of operational creditor is again linked to the operational debt. Section 5, 20 and 21 speaks about it. 20 says operational creditor means a person to whom an operational debt is owed and includes any person to whom such debt has been legally assigned or transferred. This is identical to the earlier definition of financial creditor. Now 21, operational debt means a claim in respect of provision of goods or services, including employment, or a debt in respect of the payment of dues arising under any law for the time being in force and payable to the central government, any state government, local authority. So this is the definition in respect of operational creditor and operational debt. As I pointed out, financial debt is more exhaustive. Operational debt is only restricted to certain areas. Then committee of creditors. Now section 21 speaks about committee of creditors. The interim resolution professional on collation of the claims constitutes the committee. So therefore subsection 1, you can forget it. Now subsection 2, committee of creditors shall comprise all financial creditors of the corporate debtor. Then it goes on to explain certain exclusions. These are all on cases of related parties. If suppose there is a related party who is a financial creditor, he will not have a right of participation or voting in the meeting of committee of creditors. So related parties also exhaustively defined under section 324 and 524-24A. So these are all, I will skip for the person. Now please come to subsection 4, where any person is a financial creditor as well as an operational creditor. Such person shall be a financial creditor to the extent of financial debt owed by the corporate debtor and shall be included in the committee of creditors along with voting share proportionate to the extent of financial debts owed to such creditor. So therefore, his voting right will be only to the extent of his financial debt. His operational debt will not be part of it. Then assignment of operational debt is also provided. I will not trouble you on all those things. Let us for the moment skip all those things. As you read through the provisions, you will be able to get into all aspects. Now then, subsection 10, the resolution professional shall make available any financial information so required by the committee of creditors under subsection 9 within a period of 7 days of such requisition. So this is what the constitution of committee of creditors is concerned. Now one constitution it is spoken to, it also says who can have a voting right, who will not have a voting right, how the voting right has to be decided. Now in that, what is pertinent is that no differentiation as regarding secured or unsecured. Whether it is secured or unsecured, the moment you are recognized as a financial creditor and you form part of the committee of creditors, your voting is based on the debt which you have to realize. The amount of debt is the only criteria. It is not on the basis of whether you are a secured or unsecured. Now, please see what is the role of the committee of creditors. It is provided under section 28. Now, approval of committee of creditors for certain actions. As I told you, the entire management of the corporate debtor and running through the process of CIRP is vested with the resolution professional. He is given certain rights, he is given certain duties, there are certain obligations which he also has to perform. Now he has to take all the guidance of the COC, which is the committee of creditors. Now what are all the things which the committee of creditors have to specifically approve is provided under 28. Now notwithstanding anything contained in any other law for the time being in force, the resolution professional during the corporate insolvency resolution process shall not take any of the following actions without the prior approval of the committee of creditors, namely, raise any interim finance in excess of the amount as may be decided by the COC, create any security interest over the assets of the corporate debtor, change the capital structure of the corporate debtor, including by way of issuance of additional securities, creating a new class of securities, and so on. So, record any change in ownership and interest then give instructions to financial institutions maintaining accounts of the corporate debtor for a debit transaction from any such accounts in excess of the amount as may be decided by the committee of creditors, undertake any related party transactions, amend any constitutional documents, delegate his authority. It goes on to say. So there are various things which the resolution professional will be able to do only in case if the same has been approved by the committee of creditors. Now, as I said earlier, the resolution plan has to be approved by the committee of creditors. Now, how the scheme unfolds is that once the committee of creditors is in place, the resolution professional draws up a document called as information memorandum, which he will provide as to what are all the assets of the company, what are all the liabilities of the company, and classification of these liabilities as financial debts, operational debts, other debts, government dues. All these things are put into place. Then the committee of creditors takes a decision as to calling for expression of interest from anybody to submit a resolution plan. Then based on that, an expression of interest is called for, and as and when anybody submits a resolution plan, that is evaluated in terms of an evaluation matrix, and based on which the committee of creditors make a decision as to whether it has to be approved or not. So therefore, at that stage, you will find the major role which has to be played is only by the creditors, more particularly the financial creditors. Now, unless they approve that, there is no resolution for the company which is forthcoming. This is how the scheme of the enactment. Now, when I speak about financial creditors, I need to incidentally point out one more thing is that when the code came into place, it recognized the persons who have to recover a financial debt as financial creditors in terms of the definition which you saw. An interesting situation arose where these real estate companies were getting into a lot of CARP process, either at the initiation of some financial creditors or unsecured creditors or operational creditors, whoever it is. Those companies were put before the NCLT and taken to the CARP. Now, in that process, an issue came, what will happen to the home buyers? There are persons who want to purchase a flat. They have advanced huge money. Most of these real estate companies, you are aware, they collect money from the persons who want to purchase a flat. From that, they run the situation. In fact, they sometimes even purchase a land from out of that money. They will take a power of attorney from a landowner, develop the property. So, over the period of time, the monies which mostly flow is from the home buyers. Now, therefore, when a situation came, what will happen to these home buyers? So, one such home buyer petitioned the IBBA and said that I have to recover money. Now, it is under CARP. Under what claim I have to make, whether it is a financial debt or operational debt, because it was not very clear under the provisions. Then the IBBA said there is a third claim called other claims, like government dues, everything, they have got a separate form. These are all provided under the regulations. Regulations gives you the formats on which you have to make a claim application before the RP. So if it is a financial creditor, there is form A. If it is an operational creditor, form B. Likewise, there is one form which is for other creditors who don't play any role of a financial or operation. So the IBB at the first instance said that you may go ahead and file a claim under this category as a other creditors. Now that they found that if I have to make a claim as an other creditors, and ultimately if the banks are going to decide something, they may even decide on liquidation, and they may claim I have got a security, then what will happen to the home buyers? Now this issue went before the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Chitra Sharma versus Union of India, where she questioned this very wisdom of IBBA, saying that you will fall under the other creditors. Now, pending that proceedings, in fact, Supreme Court in that particular case wanted all the home buyers also to be taken into consideration. The Supreme Court said that they will form as a separate class of creditors, and they should be heard by the COC. Any decision is taken, any resolution will be with their concurrence. Now, pending that, so the government came up with amendments, and therefore you will find in the definition of financial creditor, a class of creditors of home buyers are also recognized as financial creditors. Now, these home buyers may be in too huge in numbers. Therefore, the scheme provided is that they can have an authorized representative to attend the COC. This is one aspect. Therefore, when we speak about creditors, even the home buyers are also part of it in cases of these real estate companies. So this is the other aspect which I wanted to point out. Now, this is also based on the jurisprudence which has evolved. Ultimately, the Supreme Court recording that the government has come forward with the amendments and recognized the home buyers as financial creditors, disposed of that application. Interestingly, in that what they said is that the period of CARP which was lost in the proceedings has to be completely excluded. They said from this date, you start a fresh CARP, include all the home buyers and decide whether there is a resolution or liquidation. This is what has happened. Now let us come to the jurisprudence part of it, the judgments which came. One judgment which you can look at is the Swiss Ribbons case, which upheld the validity of the enactment as it is, upheld the validity of IBC. What Swiss ribbons held ultimately? It upheld the legislation on a point that it is an economic legislation. The intervention of the court should be minimum. This is one thing. Secondly, they said deriving so much of source from American laws and American decisions and American jurisprudence. The Honorable Supreme Court said that in cases of economic legislation, you have to provide a room for trial and error. You room for exploring the possibilities of better situations. They recorded the fact that the government has brought in very many amendments and all. But one interesting thing which I found is that in the Swiss ribbon judgment, in the last paragraph, ultimately Supreme Court recorded certain facts saying that after IBC has come into place, this much amount of has been realized by banks. This much resolution has happened. I will point out to these paragraphs. So again, there is it that the Supreme Court is giving a primacy to the fact that the creditors have a better say in the matter? Is it that the Supreme Court is driven by the fact that there is huge realization and reduction in NPA, therefore IBC is a creditors regime? I put it to you. I really do not find it as a clear answer to that. But as I said, provisions are also having different from the objects, from what the code seeks to achieve, and the manner in which the rights have been provided to the creditors in the COC. Now, then I am taking you to the decisions. Now, after the Swiss ribbon, there are three other important judgments. One is in the case of Shashidhar versus Indian Overseas Bank. Then you have Essar Steel's judgment and ArcelorMittal's judgment. Now, all these judgments you will find what in more particularly in Shashidhar's case, the issue was that there is a decision of approval of a resolution plan by the COC. Now, this goes to an approval before the NCLT. Now, the NCLT, in its wisdom, applying the provisions of the Act, suggests a certain way, saying that these people have to be paid in this manner. Like operational creditors also have to be provided something. So there were so many things which the NCLT in its order brought about, making changes to the resolution plan, as well as differing from what the Committee of Creditors said. But this was not approved by Honorable Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said the commercial wisdom of the Committee of Creditors will alone prevail. It is not for the NCLT or NCLAT to enter into that commercial wisdom and make your own decision. They only said the ultimate jurisdiction as far as NCLT and NCLT is concerned, you have to look into the provisions of the code, regulations of the code, and see if this resolution plan satisfies the requirements. Like section 30 says that the operational creditors has to be provided some basic minimum, whether this has been satisfied. Then you have to see whether the procedures have been strictly followed. So they said, this is the only decision which you can make. You cannot get into the commercial wisdom. Now, this was again followed by Essar Steels. Now, there again, 2 or 3 things which came as way of jurisprudence is that NCLAT again thought that the operational creditors has to be provided something. So it became the law of the land when Supreme Court also considered that. Then immediately government stepped in by making amendment saying that no, it is only the financial creditors who will be paid at the first instance. Only after satisfying the financial creditors, if there is payment amounts available, which will be to the satisfaction of the operational creditors. Now, these amendments were challenged before the Supreme Court. Likewise, the recognition of the home buyers by an amendment was also challenged before the Supreme Court. That was decided in the Pioneer Urban Infrastructure case where Supreme Court approved all those amendments. Likewise, these amendments were also approved by Supreme Court. And then came the latest decision where the issue was as between secured and unsecured creditors, what is to happen. But Supreme Court said under the scheme of the court, it is clear. There is no such recognition. But fact remains that a secured creditor in case of liquidation can always stand outside and say that I will enforce the security and come back. Now, in case of resolution, what resolution plan provides, what the Committee of Creditors approve. This becomes critical. Then came the latest issue as far as JP is concerned, where preferential transactions were set aside. That was a case where there is a holding company and there is a company which was getting into the real estate development. Now, this real estate development company had provided collateral security to the holding company for various borrowings they made from banks. Now, all these transactions were set aside by Supreme Court, but rather Supreme Court declared that these are all preferential transactions. So this again has now got into one more situation of so much of discussion, mostly happening on the banker side. Now, bankers are again pushing the government saying that, no, our rights which were created, our charges which were created don't dislodge. For the want of time, I am not taking you in detail of those niceties. I'm only pointing out because ultimately this is all boiling down to the situation of whether it is a creditors regime or not, or whether the creditors have their own paradise under the IBC. Now, with these backgrounds, let us again now only see a few judgments. I will only take out a few paragraphs from the judgments. Then we can get into our deliberations and discussions. Now, can I have this screen share? Yes. Yes, judgments. First will be Swiss Ribbons case, Union of India. See at paragraph 11, what the Supreme Court said is, as is discernible, the preamble gives an insight into what is sought to be achieved by the code. The code is first and foremost a code for reorganization and insolvency resolution of corporate debtors. Please make a note of a clear wordings which the Supreme Court records. Unless such reorganization is effected in a time-bound manner, the value of assets of such persons will deplete. Therefore, maximization of value of assets of such persons so that they are efficiently run as going concern is another very important objective of the code. This in turn will promote entrepreneurship as the persons in management of the corporate debtor are removed and replaced by entrepreneurs. When therefore a resolution plan takes off and a corporate debtor is brought back into the economic mainstream, it is able to repay its debts, which in turn enhances the viability of credit in the hands of banks and financial institutions. Above all, ultimately, the interest of all stakeholders are looked after as the corporate debtor itself becomes a beneficiary of the resolution scheme. Workers are paid, the creditors in the long run will be repaid in full, the shareholders, investors are able to maximize their investment. Timely resolution of a corporate debtor who is in the red by an effective legal framework would go a long way to support the development of credit markets. Since more investment can be made with funds that have come back into the economy, business then eases up, which leads overall to higher economic growth. What is interesting to note is that the preamble does not in any manner refer to liquidation. Please make note of it. It records that what is interesting to note is that the preamble does not in any manner refer to liquidation, which is only availed of as a last resort if there is either no resolution plan or the resolution plans are not up to the mark. Even in liquidation, the liquidator can sell the business of corporate debtor as a going concern. See, this is what was the other point which I was driving during my initial talk, saying that even in liquidation, it is not that sale of assets and distribution to the creditors alone. The Honorable NCLAT had passed orders stating that even in liquidation, it can be sold as a going concern. Now that has further traveled to a point now, the judgments are providing for a kind of reorganization by invoking provisions of Companies Act, even in the stage of liquidation. So they said you can invoke section 213 and submit a scheme of for reorganization at the stage of liquidation. So this was also approved by the Supreme Court. Therefore, Supreme Court records this. Then paragraph 12, it can thus be seen that the primary focus of the legislation is ensure revival and continuation of the corporate debtor by protecting the corporate debtor from its own management and from a corporate death by liquidation. The code is thus a beneficial legislation which puts the corporate debtor back on its feet, not being a mere recovery legislation for creditors. This I am emphasizing again, saying that not being a mere recovery legislation for creditors. With this statement, can we record a fact to the question today, saying that it is not a creditor's paradise? But in practice, it is not so. It is going other way. Even in this judgment, you can find that. The interests of the corporate debtor have therefore been bifurcated and separated from that of its promoters, those who are in management. Thus, the resolution process is not adversarial to the corporate debtor, but in fact protective of its interest. Then it goes on to moratorium. Let us skip all those things. Now, please see the concluding portion of the judgment. This is in Swiss Ribbons. It is given with a heading called Epilogue. The Insolvency Code is a legislation which deals with economic matters and in the larger sense deals with the economy of the country as a whole. Earlier experiments, as we have seen in terms of legislations having failed, trial having led to repeated errors, ultimately led to the enactment of the code. The experiment contained in the code, judged by the generality of its provisions and not by so-called crudities and iniquities that have been pointed out by the petitioners, passes constitutional muster. To stay experimentation in things economic is a grave responsibility, and denial of a right to experiment is fraught with serious consequences to the nation. We have also seen that the working of a code is being monitored by the central government by expert committees that have been set up in this behalf. Amendments have been made in the short period in which the code has operated, both to the code itself as well as to the subordinate legislation made under it. This process is an ongoing process which involves all stakeholders, including the petitioners. Now, please see paragraph 86. We are happy to note that in the working of the code, the flow of the financial resources to the commercial sector in India has increased exponentially as a result of financial debts being repaid. Approximately 3,300 cases have been disposed of by the adjudicating authority based on out-of-court settlement between corporate debtors and creditors, which themselves involved claims amounting to over INR 1,20,390 crores. 80 cases have since been resolved by resolution plans being accepted. Of these 80 cases, the liquidation value of 63 such cases is INR 29,788 crores. However, the amount realized from the resolution process in the region of INR 60,000 crores, which is over 202% of the liquidation value. As a result of this, Reserve Bank of India has come out with figures which reflect these results. Thus, the credit has been given by the banks and financial institutions to the commercial sector has jumped up from so on, so on, so on. So therefore, ultimately, the Supreme Court recorded all these facts on monetary terms and said that for all these reasons, we uphold that. So this is one area which I am pointing out for the factor that under the scheme of the code, under the provisions, creditors have a better say. But the objects of the code says that it is towards some other thing. Then the jurisprudence which comes about from the courts is also indicating to some extent. So this is how we have to balance. And now let us see what was the decision of Supreme Court in Sasigar versus Union Overseas Bank. Now in paragraph, this was mainly on the role of the COC, which is nothing but the financial creditors. Paragraph 35. Whereas the discretion of the adjudicating authority is circumscribed by section 31, limited to the scrutiny of the resolution plan as approved by the requisite percentage of voting share of financial creditors. Even in that inquiry, the grounds on which the adjudicating authority can reject the resolution plan is in reference to matters specified in section 32, when the resolution plan does not conform to the stated requirements. Reverting to section 32, the inquiry to be done is in respect of whether the resolution plan provides the payment of insolvency resolution process cost in a satisfied manner in priority to the repayment of other debts, the repayment of the debts of operation creditors in prescribed manner, then the management of affairs of the corporate debtor, the implementation and supervision of the resolution plan does not contravene any of this. This is the only area which the NCLT can look at. This is what Supreme Court says. The board referred to is established under section so and so, the powers of functions of that, then you can then skip all those things. So ultimately they said the commercial wisdom of the COC will be paramount. Now 39, in our view, neither the adjudicating authority nor the appellate authority has been endowed with the jurisdiction to reverse the commercial wisdom of the dissenting financial creditors, and that too on the specious ground that it is only an option of the minority financial creditors. Then it says, suffice it to observe that in the INB code and the regulations framed thereunder as applicable in October, there was no need for the dissenting financial creditors to record reasons for disagreement. So it goes on to say what are the scope of the NCLT and the COC's powers, everything. Then came the SR Steels, which almost reiterated the earlier stand, and which also said that what the resolution applicant provides in the resolution plan is of paramount importance because he is going to run the company. Then on that plan, what the COC takes as a commercial wisdom is again paramount. So with these things and the timelines it provided, the ultimate decision of the court is that it also recorded earlier judgments of SICAL, everything. Two things which they have pointed out is that this is all on the challenge. See in the middle paragraph, it is also the discretion given to the committee of creditors by the word may again makes it clear that this is only a guideline which is set out by this subsection which may apply to the committee of creditors and arriving at the business decision as to acceptance or rejection of a resolution plan. For all these reasons, therefore, we hold that the provisions of the Constitution. Then I told you about the Pioneer Urban. Let us not spend much time on that. it was basically a clash as between the RERA and IBC, as well as recognizing the rights of the home buyers. Now, these are all the jurisprudence. As I said, there are enough judgments of the enough indications as regarding the primacy of COC and financial creditors in the other judgments of Supreme Court as far as ArcelorMittal is also concerned. So this is on the background. So therefore, now let us look into the question which we posed ourselves. As I've been reiterating, is it the financial, the creditors who have a primacy in the implementation of the code? Now, any enactment to be very successful, it depends on the implementation. Now, the moment when we say implementation, as far as my personal view is concerned, primarily it is the advocates, primarily it is the legal fraternity which has to drive the entire system as regarding these implementations. Now, with this driver from the legal fraternity, we get the wisdom of the judges in terms of judgments which are being delivered on particular aspects. So, if there is an effective implementation with a very good role being played by the legal fraternity as well as the judiciary, then the enactment becomes successful. So, today you have seen that the provisions of the code provides that the creditors, rather a financial creditor, will have the major say. But it comes with an object saying that you have to look at reorganization of the companies. Then you have seen all the judgments. So with this, I am not giving a conclusive answer to this question. I am only placing it everything before you. And I leave it open for any deliberations from any of the members. And if there is any specific question and answers also, let us take it. Other than me, the learned members in the group will also be ready to answer that. Thank you very much for this wonderful time.
Thank you very much, sir. So I think again, like 1 hour, 5 minutes or 1 hour, 10 minutes, you have taken the entire session so smoothly, like such a, like with such a flow of streams. So I think we are again well versed with IBC also. Thank you very much again, sir. There have been a few questions, so I will start with Natarajan sir first. I'll unmute him sir first, and then. Natarajan sir, I'm unmuted.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I'm able to hear you. Sir.
Yeah, good evening, sir. You have
evening,
put a very pertinent question, and rightly so. You have not answered it. You have set the tone for a particular, very much of a discussion on that particular question. But I stand totally on the different spectrum. So as a layman, I don't have any experience on this branch of law or anything. But as a layman, my doubt is it not encouraging the failures? I need some lot of protection has to be given to the entrepreneurs. Otherwise, there will not be investment, there will not be development. All those things are there. But at the same time, if you look at it from a layman's point of view, is it promoting failures? You can do whatever you want, and at the end of the day, you fail. You don't have any responsibility. You just leave it to the financial institution, your financial creditors. They will come and they will manage you, and whatever possible, they will take it away. It is giving a impression to an ordinary citizen that it is encouraging failures, and in the process, and even the government is also compromising its interest. And earlier, the concept of Queen's debts and all was there. All those has been given a go by. So government is also complicity failure and promote the failure of the industries. That is one view as a layman which I can entertain. I may be wrong also. As a common man, as a layman, I see these provisions like sort of an encouragement for failures. So what do you feel, and what are the other people in this session feel about this doubt of a common man?
Okay. If there is anybody who want to add on this with a different view also, they can come in. Otherwise, I will answer this.
I can do one thing. I can. Yes. I will keep everyone in mute, but yes, I can give you access to unmute yourself. So if you want to add on, then you can unmute yourself and add. But if you are not adding on anything, please don't unmute yourself because there will be a lot of disturbances. Thank you once again.
Okay, let us go ahead because I am not able to hear any other person coming forward.
Yes,
this is a very pertinent question which he has raised. Because if you get an opportunity, you can go through the entire report of this Bankruptcy Laws Reforms Committee. They, in fact, yes. Somebody wants to say something?
No, so I think that was by mistake, sir. You can.
Okay. So they in fact discuss a lot on this. They specifically mention this word failure in business. Because my friend is raising a point saying that, will it not encourage failure in business? Now, what the report says is that on various deliberations, taking into consideration of various material facts as well as data, they point out there are bona fide failures in business. They say that failure can be in two ways. One is business failure, which is basically due to a mismatch or due to economic conditions or monetary failures. I may have conceived a project of 2 crores. I would not have been able to mobilize that. Rather, I would have mobilized it, but there is an enhancement today. So this is, then they also record there is a failure in terms of a concept or the model. So these are two things which the committee took up and they have deliberated a lot. And more particularly, they say in cases of business failure on account of the system, either the model or the technology, if it is a technology failure, they say that there is a requirement to give a way out. Then on the second thing, they say that if there is a business failure which is due to bona fide reasons. See, for example, a few years back, you would have thought about tape recorders with the cassette players and all. Would anybody would have seen that down the line, within 2 years or 3 years, cassette players will become obsolete and you will come into CDs. And after the CDs become obsolete, you become DVDs. Today, nobody is even touching a CD or DVD. Everything is in your mobile, everything is in your laptop, everything is in internet. So these kind of technological developments also lead to certain kind of failures in the business. So I say bona fide failures and failures to do these kind of issues has to be addressed. This is what the committee says. Therefore, one reason for which they propose a code is that to address these situations, to have a easy way out. Now, when my friend said that, is it not encouraging? I will differ in his view, saying that it will not encourage, because if you look at the provisions also speak about various transactions being put to question. In the CIRP process, it is not like that. I have failed, I have suffered loss, therefore I am holding it. Let the committee of creditors take it up, do it. It is not so. The code provides that transactions can be gone into. They can test it on whether it is preferential transaction, whether it is fraudulent transaction, whether it is extortionate credit transactions, avoidable transactions. So these are all areas which has to evolve. We have in fact seen, as I said, Supreme Court in the latest decision has dealt with preferential transaction when they set aside all these collateral securities being created. This is the first time matter went up to Supreme Court. There are other areas which has to be explored. In fact, as an advocate, I feel that there is a huge lack because NCLTs and these IBC proceedings are mostly being taken up by the company secretaries, chartered accountants, and they have been driving. Yes, on figures, on numbers, on their area, they have their strength. But when it comes to having this adjudicated before the judicial forum, it is advocates who have to step in, and these transactions has to be. So therefore, this will be all put to question, one area. Second area, the code extensively provides about penalties. It provides of prosecution. Two areas. One, it says there will be certain transactions which will be put to test. Therefore, the NCLT will pass orders imposing penalty and bringing back that monies. The promoters will be asked to deposit that monies. There are other areas which says penal provisions, which prosecution will be before a special court. So my personal view is that if this entire code with all these checks and balances is put to use, is put to force and an implementation, I think it will take care of this situation. Therefore, there cannot be a situation where I can just fail and leave it. But still, the committee recognized this situation of saying that if there is failure, there is a requirement to see that that is gotten over.
May I supplement, sir? I am L. Balaji here.
Yes.
I would like to add, being an accountant too, I would like to add, apart from
Yes.
the fact that that could be a failure, etc. The institutions which are financial creditors, per se, they are in the business of financing. So they will also have to observe their business laws. They cannot always be expected to refer full. The loss of money is inbuilt into their business system. So they could have also even evaluated whether to fund this company at all at the beginning. They have evaluated at some point of time it is worthwhile to finance. They have financed.
Correct.
They have taken their business risk. So it is not a question of somebody failing and somebody gaining or somebody losing out of somebody's failure. It is each one having their own business risks, and a financial institution also being a person taking risk in respect of its business has to give something in the final process of recovery.
Correct.
So, my name is Kritika. If I may just add to what ND Balaji sir was saying,
Yes.
the fact that the court has also taken control from the promoters and put it in the hands of a committee of creditors, that also strengthens the fact that the financial creditors are only going to decide how the assets are then going to be split up in the waterfall mechanism that you explained very clearly.
Yes.
So I feel this is another move that will ultimately only strengthen business in India.
Yes. But primarily, they have to look at what is the object. It is towards the maximization of assets and towards looking at reorganization.
Yes.
It's not for the liquidation. So that
Correct.
balance is what I feel over the period of time, by way of jurisprudence, it has to come up and develop.
Yes.
Here I have Maithili.
Yes.
Yes. See, I have a take on this, continuing further on what Mr. Natarajan was talking about. At some level, our laws seem to be trying to make it easier to default, whether it's taxes. For instance, we have had any number of these schemes, both in indirect taxes and direct taxes, saying, okay, you pay 30%, it's enough, 50%. And even in this IBC, some of the payment of statutory dues is given the least preference, which at some level seems extremely unfair for people who are compliant with the laws. What is something, there has to be some kind of a balancing, otherwise
Correct.
one would not see any purpose in
Correct.
doing
I agree with you. I agree with you. Who is being regularly paying, he is not being rewarded in any manner.
Yes.
He doesn't have an incentive out of it.
Yes, and he's
A person who is in default is incentivized. It is there as far as you said, even the tax issues also it is there.
So ultimately what you end up doing is, at some level the taxation will go up to cover all this. Somewhere the money has to come in. So I think that needs to, the government needs to take a harder look at this aspect. And also the overall morale of a taxpayer will one day take a hit. An honest taxpayer will say, why will I pay taxes when those who are defaulting are going scot-free?
In fact, sir, I have a different take on this.
Yes.
Speaking from the customs department angle. See, normally the dues to the central government is the first charge. But if we, just for an instance, I'm just saying, say section 142A of the Customs Act says that it is first charge, but subject to the provisions of IBC. Therefore, as I understand, the debts owed to the government is an operational debt. Am I right in that?
No, government debts are placed at a different category. It is not even an operational debt.
Okay. Then how
they call it as other debts?
Other debts, is it?
Yes.
So then, as far as the position is concerned, when the prioritization happens, what would be the level of priority that the government dues are given? When suppose the IRP is appointed, what is the level of priority that is given to the government dues?
It is on the last. Let us see 1 minute. I will just share the screen.
Yes.
Can I have the screen share for a moment? I will just show you that 53 mechanism.
Sir, 1 minute, sir. Before you answer this, I will also add a short question connected to that.
Yes.
What will be the position, say the income tax dues or those dues, where those respective departments do not present themselves before the committee of creditors or before the resolution professional and state it like, is it that the entire demand that is raised by them statutorily is lost? You may add that also in your answer.
Yes, yes, okay. Now let us only see that waterfall mechanism, what 53 provides for. See, this is that. At the first instance, cost of CIRP and liquidation cost to be paid in full. Then second, pari passu among secured creditors who have relinquished their right with workman dues for 24 months. So secured creditors who have relinquished their security and agreed to be part of the CIRP or the liquidation, they will be paid pari passu along with workmen for 24 months alone. Then third is wages of employees other than workmen for 12 months. Then fourth is financial debts to unsecured creditors. Then fifth comes pari passu among government dues for a period of 2 years and unpaid amount of secured creditor after enforcement. Persons who have went out, enforced, and for balance they come here. So they will be pari passu with government for a period of 2 years. Then any other remaining debt, so on, so on. So this is how it is there. Now this therefore, in fact, all these priorities, as I pointed out, if you have seen that objects also, that object itself, objects of the code itself said, please again see that. Now object of the code itself, that last 3 lines, balance the interest of all stakeholders, including alteration in the order of priority of payment of government dues, so on, so. So this object itself is on that. Therefore, today it has now shuttled everything. In terms of waterfall mechanism under 53, they come at the 5th stage. Now, one question came that if I have not made a claim to the RP, if I have not made a claim to the COC, it is actually claimed to the RP, not the COC, but it is binding on them. If you have missed the Supreme Court in 2 judgments recorded the fact that whoever be the stakeholder, the resolution plan once approved is binding on them. And thereafter, you cannot make any claim. If you have missed the bus, it is gone. Now, interestingly, if you see, there was one judgment of Supreme Court in the case of embassy properties, which went from Chennai only. In that decision, a company's mining lease was suspended or cancelled during the CIRP period. That was questioned before NCLT. NCLT passed an order saying that this action has happened during the moratorium, therefore this is not valid. You restore the mining lease immediately. Now, this was challenged by the state of Karnataka before the High Court, but having gone before the High Court, that became a question before the Supreme Court, whether the High Court can interfere or not. They should have gone before the appellate. So this was the issue before the Supreme Court. Supreme Court ultimately in that judgment, it's a very good read, which says that in cases of public loss, NCLT will not have jurisdiction. They said a mining lease is within the domain of a public law being administered by the state. And therefore, the NCLT could not have held anything against it. The most interesting thing is that immediately after this judgment, amendment came to the IBC. Please look at that amendment. Amendment said that government dues, everything will be subject to NCLT proceedings, or rather subject to CIR. So they don't want that public law concept should be again made applicable to these tax dues and other things and say that no, I am outside the IBC provisions. So amendment came which said that no, you are also amenable to IBC. So this is what is the march of law which is happening. So whether you file a claim or not, you are bound by that. You cannot make a claim thereafter. It's clear as far as IBC.
Therefore, the government has to be as vigilant as the SSC in terms of the recovery of dues.
Yes. As IBC provisions, if I am correct, there is also an amendment to income tax. Only in cases of income tax dues, before approval of the resolution plan, the NCLT is required to send a notice to the Commission of Income Tax. That provision is there as part of the regulations. Likewise, Income Tax Act is also amended, whereas they have not recognized other dues, either central excise or GST, nothing is there. Only income tax, they have said this.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I think Hema madam can add a few points on that particular income tax due because
I have one doubt for sir.
No, because I have seen you, ma'am, appearing in NCLT for the department also. That's why.
That's okay. That's another part of it. As usual, the department files its claim late. Then we have to again convince the judge, the NCLT member why we were late, etc. So let's forget that part of it. I have a practical query. Sir, the promoter is the best boss of his business.
Yes.
When he is unable to run his business, how is it practically possible or how far is it fruitful that an IRP will run the business in a better manner?
Okay. See, as far
Does
as
it really work practically?
No, scheme of the code is concerned, IRP is to only keep the status of going concern continuing.
Yes.
If it is a running concern with all things happening, IRP will only just continue that aspect. And in fact, the regulation says that he can take the assistance of directors also to run it. If it is a business failure and there is a complete stoppage, then IRP is not required to run it.
No, but in most businesses where an IRP has been appointed, we find that the directors or promoters do not cooperate with the IRP. So practically, I don't find that the IRPs and the directors work together for reviving the company.
See, it is a very healthy situation which we have to develop. Please see the case of SR Steel Salon. Please read that Supreme Court judgment. During the CARP process, that company had made crores and crores of rupees. It was continuing, it was doing everything. So it is only one thing is that professionalism which has to come. The wisdom of the COC represented by the creditors which has to come. Like we, as you said, practical side, we have seen in cases where company is running, workmen are there, they have orders. But once CARP come, promoters is stepping away. Bank is stepping away. They're not even ready to provide an interim finance. So that difficulties are there. But code provides that you have an interim finance, you can run it, you can do that. So it is not the IRP alone has to be running the company. He can take the assistance of the suspended directors. He can even ask the COC to put in place a small committee which can run the situation. He can take the experts. All those positions are there. It is all towards a healthy system which is there. As I said, if advocates, if we are able to see an effective implementation, bring into the healthy system, then it is workable.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, Raja here. I have one question.
Yes, sir.
So can we just...
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Continue, sir. Sorry.
Sir, the IBC is Creditors Paradise. My one more question is that when a company is subject to IBC proceedings, the debtor's debtor, I owe some money to debtor company. I being, if the debtor wants to recover that money from me, in the normal course, he could have gone to any civil court or a commercial court. But just because it is being wound up or being proceeded against, I am unnecessarily dragged into IBC court. Will it not amount to a creditor's paradise as the topic is?
To some extent, it's correct. But once under a particular scheme of an enactment, if things are being sought to be redressed for a resolution before one forum, so this should also go. In fact, section 60 subsection 5 says that NCLT will have jurisdiction to decide all questions of law, facts, which is arising as CARP process and that of the corporate debtor. So in a workable mechanism, see, you cannot expect an RP to go before different courts, fight there. Like this instance which you say, if suppose the company is in Chennai and the client you are referring to, a debtor who is in Bombay, you will have that practical difficulty. And in a given time frame, because we are looking at ultimately things to happen within 180 days, 240 days or so and so. So if no proceedings had been initiated, he can wait. There is a moratorium period, limitation will be saved. Thereafter, whoever takes up, they can do. See, as an RP, he can record it as a receivables in the information memorandum. So this will be part of the assets of the company. Or if there is a requirement to a pending proceedings to be continued, as in the case of Companies Act, IBC also provides that either it can be transferred to NCLT or he can take a leave and say that I will continue that proceeding. So RP can continue. If suppose something has to be initiated afresh, then again it is the COC's wisdom and the RP to be taken up. But we cannot find fault with it. Rather, Supreme Court does not approve such situations also, saying that being a specialized enactment on a situation of a resolution which we are looking at, it has to go through. There is no other way.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So before we take up the next question, there are already a few questions in line. I will just we'll quickly give them a chance first. Sir, Mr. Sundareshwaran sir, I wanted to ask.
Yes, sir.
Sundareshwaran sir, are you able to hear me? You can unmute yourself. Yeah. Yes, sir. Sir, can you? Are you able to hear me?
Hello, sir.
Yes, sir. Good evening.
Very good evening, sir. It was very nice, and I had been to the NCLT twice or thrice, but they are doing a very good job. I have a small doubt in this case. It's a case where if a claim application is filed by the creditor, be it a first creditor or second creditor, as the case may be, operative creditors or
financial
creditor. Yes, the RP passes an order, but the order is not communicated in hard copy. It is in the soft copy. Now the tribunal says that it cannot entertain unless the hard copy is filed, but the RP is not giving the hard copy.
That is wrong. Actually, it cannot be done. We are, most of the things are going by soft copies only. IBC itself recognizes. In fact, IBC makes it mandatory that a claim of a financial creditor should be only by email. It does not even suppose us filing of an hard copy. A claim by a financial creditor in terms of the regulations can be only by electronic means. That is a mandatory provision. So therefore, electronic communications are fully accepted. Yours may be a stray case because NCLT cannot say that. Likewise, RP is not adjudicating. The code is very clear. In fact, Supreme Court made it very, very clear. He doesn't exercise an adjudicatory power. RP collates the details. So he receives your claim, verifies the books of the company, and if he finds it is there, he recognizes your claim. Suppose he says that with all the documents I have, I am not able to accept your claim. Then you have to go before the NCLT, establish your claim, and get an order so that your claim is also included. So in that process, there is no question of order being passed or a hard copy of the order being there. If there is an email where, even in fact, there are cases where RP does not even communicate. Parties go before the NCLT and say that I have filed a claim. I am not finding place in the list of creditors because it is displayed in the website. I am not finding a place and I do not have a communication also. Therefore, issue a direction to the RP to include my claim in the list of claimants. So that is possible.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Sir, next week, Mr. Satish.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Satish.
Sir, my query is regarding a third category of the creditors. You have taken us through this financial creditors, operation creditors, and other creditors. My query will be in connection with the other creditors. Sir, the definition debt, as shown in the defined under section 3 subclass 11, says that any liability or obligation in respect of the client. And the provision 3 subclass 6 says that claim means a right of payment whether no such right is reduced to judgment or not, and B, right to remedy for breach of contract.
Yes.
My question pertains to 6 subclass B. In the event of in a contract, in the event there being an clause agreeing for a liquidated damages, am I not entitled to file a claim before NCLT, sir?
Yes. You are entitled to file a claim before the RP if the company is held under CARP. If you want to initiate a proceedings,
yes, sir, that is my query.
You are entitled to, provided that obligations under the contract you have to establish whether it is coming within the meaning of a financial debt or an operational debt.
My exact query is that, sir, because I come across one judgment of Bombay NCLT.
If it is not within the meaning of a financial debt or operational debt, you are not a person who can initiate CARP.
Because it's a classic cases where when we avail the services of the ship, when we hire the ships on charter trip, yes, and the ship is detained by the person, naturally the ship detention of the ship invites demurrages. The demurrages clause will be found in the charter ship agreement itself. In such of those cases, what will be the position of the charter? Because the damage is very clearly stipulated in the agreement. Knowing fully well he hires the ship. Now, the fact that there is a delay is proved before NCLT through the port document. That being the case, my question is twofold, sir. How am I to be classified? Will he be classified as an other creditor? And whether my debt will be treated as other debt or I will be treated as an operation debt?
If it is consequences to the services rendered.
Yes, sir.
In this case, you say that there is a service agreement with the carrier,
yes, sir,
wherein you have entrusted a work to be done by them.
Yes, sir.
Right? It is consequences to the services rendered and a provision for demurrage charges which is to be borne by which party is there in the agreement.
Yes, sir.
If you are able to bring up that and establish a fact as an operational debt, you find. But in this aspect, in fact, there is one case which is pending before Supreme Court. That is a case of Delhi Metro Rail, where within the metro station, they give the space for advertising. So one person has given an advance and taken an advertisement site. Subsequently, that is cancelled. He says, you give back the money to me. Money is not paid. So he took them to NCLT saying that I have to recover a debt. Therefore, you initiate CIRP against them. But NCLT found that you are not coming within the operational debt. Therefore, you will not be entitled to. Now that went to NCLT and it is now pending before Supreme Court. So that may throw some light. As of now, requirement is that establish that there is an operational debt. It may be a breach, it may be consequences to that, or it may be a liquidated damages provided. What is the original service is the point.
Yes, sir. Because I also
that is established. You come. If it is not established, you don't have a right to initiate. But if somebody initiates, you have a right to make a claim.
I follow, sir. Because I also come across a judgment of NCLT Bombay, Tata Chemicals Limited as Raj Process Equipments, where they have held that unless you establish your entitlement to the damage in a manner known to law, you cannot file an application.
Yes.
Anyhow, sir, thank you for your clarification.
Thank you, Satish.
Mr. Bosco?
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Thank you for the wonderful session. Sir, I have a query, small query, maybe a basic. Sir, we don't have any financial claim. We have received all the money.
Yes.
So only the issue C form is not received. The differential tax alone is coming under 2.5 crore. What is the remedy for us, sir?
It will be other creditor only, other claims. You will not be able to initiate. If there is already somebody initiated, you will be able to make a claim and stand in the last category as other claimants.
Okay.
See, CIRP can be initiated by very clear. It can be either the financial creditor or operational creditor, including workmen. Only in the case of the workmen, the code as well as the regulations say that even group of workmen can join together and initiate.
Okay.
Otherwise, nobody can initiate.
Now the situation, IRP is over and now the liquidator stage is there. Now I can apply.
You can file a claim. Even in liquidation, independently, claims will be called for. In fact, in liquidation, the claims, there is a provision which says adjudication of the claims will happen. And if you are aggrieved with the adjudication, you can go to NCLT for against that. That is specifically provided.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. So, like 2-3 more questions, sir.
Yes, sir. No issues.
Ilangovan, sir.
Yeah. Sir, good evening, sir.
Good evening, Ilangovan.
Sir, very good presentation, sir. Sir, if I am being a secure creditor or financial creditor who stands outside of CIRP and enforce my security on my own, either by SARFAESI or any other mode, and satisfy part of debt, and there are remaining debts are left out, shall I claim or file a claim again under IPC, sir?
See, 3 things I will tell. One is that if there is already a CIRP, even if you are a secured creditor, you are bound to make a claim. At that stage, when the CIRP process is going on, you cannot say that I will stand outside and I will enforce my security. This is first thing. So you have to subject yourself, file a claim, because all your proceedings, including SARFAESI proceeding, there is a moratorium. So you cannot go ahead. You have to make a claim here and you should be part of the COC, you should be part of the resolution, whatever it comes up. This is point number 1. Point number 2, in liquidation, you can say as a secured creditor, I want to stand outside, that is section 52. You will go enforce your security interest. Then for the balance, you will make a claim before the liquidator. Rather, you will say, I have this much claim. Suppose at the initial stage itself, you will make a claim this much. I have a claim, but I am enforcing my security interest outside the liquidation proceeding. So per balance, you can seek for recovery. That is permitted. It is provision is there. Then third situation which you are saying is that even before CIRP everything, I have already enforced. I have realized there is something shortfall which I have to recover. That again will be part of a claim in the CIRP or liquidation as an unsecured creditor.
Sir, one other question, sir.
Yes.
Sir, the basic for this IBC code or the object behind this, there is a ease in doing the business and economic stimulation and foreign investment and this kind of things are there. Earlier there was a DRP which failed in all your setup. And there comes this SARFAESI. Without looking into the basic Indian judicial system or without digging into the basic economic system of India, is it not our higher side just because someone wants to make an investment, we are keep on searching for some innovative method adopted by other countries who are all developed countries, and much as less what is the common Indian Who is battling in the court? Who has been left out?
Okay. I will
Now,
take it
the
this
company,
way.
the companies, whether the companies is more than 100 crores, can be given a priority in IBC.
Okay.
So that it can
I'll
slowly
take
come
it this
down.
way. The
Yes.
first issue which you raised up is a larger economic issue. To be very, very clear, economists are required to answer that. Okay. But lastly, you ended up saying that a common man has to go behind all these things and all this. In fact, there is a division. When you speak about a larger issue about the ease of doing business, India not ranking and inviting investors, all these things, it is an economic issue. Economic experts have felt that this is what is the requirement. But having dealt with this subject as a lawyers, what we can look at about is that it is not that investors are coming to invest. It is the country's interest, you invite investments. That is how the economy is now going, be it whatever. Even in this situation, you know that the moment there is some loss of business in China or European companies does not want to go to China, what Indian government is doing? They are inviting them to make an investment here. So therefore, there is a larger issue. We cannot get into it. Ultimately, we look at one is strengthening the banking system. In all the economic downfalls, it is said that we were able to sustain because of a strong banking system. So that is one consideration. Second thing is that economic growth happening. To economic growth to happen in a World Economic Forum. Today you are a world economy. You cannot no more claim that my economy is only my country. Any economy is reflected based on any happening worldwide. It is a liberalized society. So in terms of that, you are bound to take these things. I should today rank in ease of doing business, only then I can invite investment. I being at the fag end, I don't have an effective legal system, I don't have an effective adjudicative system. I cannot go to the forum and say that, no, you come and invest in India. So this is one small thing which I tried to put it across as my view. Okay, this is a larger issue which has to be addressed.
It's a basic legal system which is not at made ready, or it should be made applicable to the top 100 companies.
You need to read Swiss ribbons. You read Swiss ribbons of Supreme Court. Then they say basic legal system is far different from testing economic laws. In fact, we had one session yesterday where there was a talk about Mr. K.V. Vishnath, senior advocate, was enlightening us on the point saying that the doctrine of manifest arbitrariness as a ground to challenge a law. So there he said, when this doctrine is adopted, is accepted and made applicable to many cases, when it came to challenges to economic law, Supreme Court said no. They said, I will not apply this doctrine of manifest arbitrariness. Economic laws are entirely different.
Okay.
So that is on a larger issue.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we'll quickly take up 2 more questions, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Sir, Mr. Murthy.
Yes, Murthy. Good evening.
Murthy, sir.
Yeah, good evening, sir. Sir, mine is not a question. My view on the heading of today's topic may be fine-tuned as is IBC instead of creditor's paradise can be a financial or operational creditor up to the point of admitting a company and thereafter financial creditor's paradise. Especially by considering the judgment by Supreme Court holding that wisdom of the committee of creditors is the paramount thing, and the adjudicating authority as well as the appellate authority cannot touch the decision. And in this regard, with due respect to Supreme Court, there are few instances where the Supreme Court's view, I feel, has been misused. Where in an approval of resolution plan, the committee of creditors consisting of the financial creditors approved a plan with a condition where one clause says whatever the litigation expenses after the date of approval will be borne by the related parties. In that case, the related parties, their claim was admitted and they are entitled for payment of few crores. And this clause in the resolution plan having been approved by the committee of creditors, so that the adjudicating authority or the appellate authority cannot touch it. And it went up to NCLAT as well. And the plan has been approved, confirmed. And in such a situation, by making use of the wisdom of the commercial creditor being paramount, would it require any further evolution or march of law to fine-tune this principle as held by the Supreme Court?
Okay.
So this is only for a panel discussion.
Yeah. Adding to that, I will only add 2 points. One is that, as you said, we have spoken enough about financial creditors, COC, everything. But there is one aspect, because you are also practitioner before NCLT, you file very many cases, I know that. At the initiation of CARP itself, there is a biggest advantage the creditor has. Today, even an operational creditor, the moment he threatens that I will initiate a petition, cases are settled. So we have seen cases of operational creditors getting settled. That is about 50 to 60%. So there again, you see only the creditor. You don't see as financial operation creditor. So therefore, invoking IBC today is a creditor's paradise. I don't spend court fee. I don't wait for a decree to be obtained, and I don't wait for execution. The moment I issue a notice, go before NCLT, there is an opportunity that it can get settled. My money is being paid. So it is happening within 3 months to 6 months.